What's up, cooks? Welcome to the Card Kitchen. I am the Card Chef, and today we are cooking up the top 10 decks of the week. That's right, the top 10 decks of the week. So let's just get into them right away, starting with the first one, the Mewtwo Gardevoir. This is actually the first time we have brought up Mewtwo Gardevoir on this series, and it's usually because there's not really much to say. The deck has not really changed all that much. It's still 2 Gardevoir lines, 2 Mewtwo EX, and of course the baby Mewtwo is becoming a standard at 1 copy in this deck. There are other versions that have been playing Jinx. However, I don't personally like the Jinx. It feels kind of like a mini Alakazam. However, I don't find the damage output to be all that great. And so I just don't feel like it's necessary in this deck, to be honest. This deck does not play Giovanni's. I feel I've been trying to look at all the different deck lists that are the Mewtwo, and it seems the ones that are doing the best have cut Giovanni, which I'm kind of surprised about. It's kind of an interesting thing to see, because you would think the Giovanni would be really good in this deck, because the fact that the Psychic Sphere does 50 damage with the Giovanni, that's 60 HP of damage. That takes a lot of basic Pokemon that need to evolve. We already kind of know how strong the 40 plus 10 is in this game. Things like Farfetch'd and Giovanni together can take out a lot of 50 HP Pokemon, and I feel like there's a lot more 60 HP. We even hear people talking about they would prefer to play the old Jigglypuff over the new Jigglypuff because of that 10 extra HP. And so I find it interesting that Giovanni's are being cut. However, this does seem to be more often than not the build, the one on the screen that is the most successful. So it would be interesting to see if Giovanni's come in or out of this deck going forward. And with that being said, let's move on to the next deck. And the next deck and the rest of these decks actually start to get a lot more interesting. The next deck we're talking about is Charizard Moltres. And why is this interesting? It's because last week, the Arcanine Charizard deck, okay, that seemed to be by far the definitive version of the deck that we all said was most likely the top fire deck in the game right now. It had like 4 tops in 3 massively huge tournaments, 3 which were finalists and 2 of which were winning decks. No Arcanine Charizard decks made it to a top finish or a winning finish this week. However, this deck did. I do believe the Charizard Arcanine overall did better. They had a lot more tops and a higher win rate overall. However, this is the only Charizard deck that won this week in a tournament with 250 or more people. And so I guess it really depends what your matchups are, what decks are in that specific tournament, or it might just be that sometimes the Charizard Arcanine decks are just too bulky. It could also be the fact that water decks have increased a tremendous amount, which is another thing I had said we are probably going to see happen again, because Pikachu was doing so good in the meta at one point. Water decks dropped down to like a 6% meta share. When I say water decks, I'm really only talking about the Starmie Articuno or Starmie Greninja or Articuno Greninja, and then the one-off other decks, of course. However, they were down to like 6% last week at one point, and then finally by the end of the week got up to around a 9.3% usage in tournaments. Now they are always at least the top 4 tournaments that I looked at, those water decks, the meta share of those decks was about 10%. And so it makes sense that a deck like Charizard Arcanine would see less of a chance of making it further, perhaps, because you have so many EX Pokemon, being Charizard and Arcanine being weak to water. And if you get those bad matchups, you can easily just lose especially in a top bracket situation. But it's interesting to see that both decks are still doing very good, and it's going to be one of those things. It's almost like the Pikachu, right? Which Pikachu is better? And speaking of Pikachu, let's get into the Pikachu decks because I got two of them for you. So the next deck we want to talk about is a Pikachu EX deck, and it's the Pikachu Electro deck. However, it teched in a 1/1 line of Zebstrika, and I had been thinking for a while that this would probably be a good idea, not specifically Zebstrika in the Electro build, but just in general. The way Pikachu decks are generally built is that it's a minimum or a standard of 7 basic Pokemon, 2 Pikachu, 2 Zapdos, and then one other basic that doesn't evolve, either a Pinchirin, Baby Zapdos, or Electabuzz, and then 2 Stage 1 lines that are the exact same line, so either 2 Electrode lines, 2 Zebstrika line, or 2 Raichu line. And so basically what this deck did is it took the Electro build, and instead of putting the 7th basic as either the Baby Zapdos, the Electabuzz, or the Pinchirin, what they did is they added a Blitzel and a Zebstrika line, just one of. And I thought this was probably going to happen at some point. I had been thinking about it for like a really long time and wondering if people were going to start doing this, and it does seem people are doing this, and I think it's a really good idea. I don't think the Zapdos, the Electabuzz, or the Pinchirin are actually really that great. And if you are going to play the 7th basic, because the effect of Pikachu's attack is so important, then why not just make it a 1/1 line of any one of those builds? And what's interesting is this continues to happen. I will be interested to see that in maybe the Zebstrika build, where it's 2 Zebstrika, is it going to be 1 Raichu line or 1 Electro line? And then in the Raichu decks, is it going to be 1 Electro line or 1 Zebstrika line? Or maybe it will be something else. And with that being said, let's get into the next Pikachu deck. So this is the next Pikachu deck, and I absolutely love it. So this is a Magneton Raichu deck, and basically it's the same concept of the last build. And what you're doing, instead of playing just 2 of the same Stage 1 lines, you're playing 2 different Stage 1 lines, except in this case, they're actually playing 2 full different Stage 1 lines, 2 Magneton lines, 2 Raichu line. And instead of having the 2 standard Pikachu and 2 standard Zapdos, you're playing 2 Pikachu and only 1 Zapdos, and then making the room in the deck for those Magnetons, as well as additional Lieutenant Surges. Now, this deck is not playing Giovanni's, and it's probably because they wanted to play more Lieutenant Surge. So this deck, I believe, got 7th or 9th place in a tournament. It went, hold on one second here, real quick. It went 11-1, and yes, it got 9th in one tournament and actually got 4th in another. And the tournament it got 9th place in was the Ursi Day tournament with like 1,500 people, which is super interesting for a deck like this because I have not seen this version of the deck do very well. However, it might have actually been doing a lot better than we think, because the way the decks are like broken down on these play limitless TCG is you only see if it's a Pikachu Raichu build, you just see kind of like Pikachu Raichu. So unless you click on every single deck to see what the actual deck build is, it might have actually seen this version a lot more often, but maybe we just didn't realize. But it would be pretty cool if this is like starting to become like a really strong version. I've always liked Magneton, Lieutenant Surge, and Raichu. I think those 3 cards combo super duper well together, and I'm wondering if, like, do we even really need the Zapdos? Like, is it mandatory to have the 7 basics at this point? And especially since we're playing 2 Pokeball, can we maybe remove that Zapdos? Or do we really need it for the super duper late game if we don't get the Raichu on board? So it would be interesting to see. I really love this deck. I love the fact that Magneton is finding its way into the meta, and we're starting to not just see three versions of Pikachu, but now we're starting to see multiple even more versions of it. It kind of creates like this interesting conversation as to what the best Pikachu build is. And honestly, I think there is no definitive answer to that. I honestly believe it comes down to the matchups you are more often going to see in any given tournament. And so if you're going to be playing tournaments, I think the best thing to do is to really kind of track tournaments, kind of track and see where the meta shares are. Is there a lot more Mewtwo in the meta currently? Is there a huge rise in the Charizard decks? Is there a huge rise in water decks? And whatever it may be, you have to build the deck to suit what you believe the current meta is going to look like in the tournament you're playing. So what you can do is at the beginning of the week, you can start to track tournaments and kind of get an idea of where the meta has shifted, as well as the previous week, to see, okay, what was the meta share last week? Was there a lot more Mewtwo than previous? Was there a lot more Charizard than previous? And then build your deck accordingly, and that's what the best Pikachu deck will be for that week. And with that being said, let's get into the next deck. So this is the next deck we want to talk about. It's the Arbok Weezing deck, teched in with the 1/1 line of Jigglypuff, Wigglytuff. This deck is still doing very well, and a lot of versions of this deck are doing very well as well. It's basically two Arbok, two Weezing, and one Wigglytuff line, and the other versions, some versions you'll see just no Arbok and two Wigglytuff, two Weezing, or sometimes you'll just see two Arbok, two Weezing. And this deck is very good. This deck also sometimes will play things like Giovanni. This version is not, which I think is okay because you already have a ton of cards that rely on combo pieces. I do believe this is a combo deck. You need things like Koga to combo with Weezing, and things like Sabrina to combo with Arbok to get certain things into the active to lock them in. And in a combo deck, you want things that you can stall the game out, things like Jigglypuff, Wigglytuff being able to put your opponent's Pokemon to sleep, or tank in with your Wigglytuff or Weezing to draw into those combo pieces. I also believe that this is probably the best Wigglytuff deck. There's a ton of different versions out there right now. Like I said, there's either the full-on Weezing and Wigglytuff version with no Arbok. There's also a Greninja and Wigglytuff deck that was doing pretty well as well. And then the next deck that we're going to talk about is also the Wigglytuff Executor build, which continues to do well. We talked about that deck last week. However, the reason I think this deck is probably the best version is because when you play the Greninja build, you open yourself up to being weak to electric, and there's a ton of electric in the meta. And when you play the Executor build, you open yourself up to weakness to fire, which there's also a ton of in the meta. This deck is only weak to one type, and it's the fighting type, and you don't see a lot of it. You may begin to see a lot of it if there's no answer to the electric decks. We might start to see a lot more fighting. I don't think we will, only because the best fighting decks tend to have fighting type Pokemon that are weak to Psychic, and Psychic is also one of the top metas decks in the game right now. And with that being said, let's get into the next deck. So the next deck we want to talk about is the Wigglytuff Executor deck. This deck last week we talked about, and it won a tournament last week, and I think it also got second place as well. So this deck is very good, and what we had talked about last week is the fact that you're basically playing the two stage ones in the game with the most bulkiest HP. You have the Wigglytuff EX with 140, and you have the Executor EX with 160. And then on top of that, you're also playing the third most bulkiest HP Pokemon for a stage 1 in the Baby Executor. This deck here was actually piloted by a content creator named Jeff Hoogland. He's a very good card player. He's very good with math when it comes down to breaking down decks, and he did something very interesting in this deck, which was he added a lot more Pokemon than I thought this deck would want. However, he was very successful with it. He played the 2 Baby Executor and 1 Executor EX, which I do agree with. The next deck we're going to talk about is another Executor build, and I do believe you want your early game Executors to be the Baby Executors. You do not want to give up a 2-price Pokemon early on in the game. He is playing the 2 Jigglypuff promo, which I think is great. This deck is starting to make, or this card is making Wigglytuffs a lot more viable, in my opinion. But what he has also done is when he added the 2 Wigglytuff EX, he also added the additional Baby Wigglytuff, and I would believe that this is probably because you want to be able to have another option, either 1, a single price Pokemon, or 2, something that can attack earlier, other than the 3 energy requirement of the Wigglytuff EX. And then he also played a Farfetch'd. The Farfetch'd is great for getting early damage onto Pokemon, especially since the ceiling of this deck is 80 damage, 90 with a Giovanni. So you want to be able to get that early game damage. With something like a Farfetch, you start attacking in right away, possibly either just take out some early Pokemon, get some early prizes, or start attacking in and getting damage on very high HP Pokemon. So when you do bring in these Executors or these Wigglytuffs, you can start actually one-shotting them with your newer Pokemon, since the damage output is very low. However, these type of decks want to be able to tank as much as possible so that when you do chip into damage over time, you eventually take the game. And with that being said, let's get into the next deck. So the next deck we want to talk about is an Executor Weezing deck. And this is a personal build of mine that I call Green Ninja, because the green from the grass type and the ninja from the Koga. And last week when we talked about the same 2 decks we just talked about, the Wigglytuff Weezing deck and the Executor Wigglytuff deck, I came up with the idea that maybe if you took the Executor and the Weezing and put them in a deck together, it might be very successful. And I did have some success with this. I actually really liked this deck. And so basically what you do is you have still 2 very high HP tanky stage 1 Pokemon in Weezing and Executor, except the cool thing that you can do with these 2, which you can't do with the Wigglytuff, is heal them a tremendous amount. Because you're playing Executor EX, you can play the Ericas, so your Executor or your Baby Executor who have very high HP can tank a lot, and then because you're playing 2 Potion and 2 Erica, you can heal them up as often as possible. And as for the Weezing, because he can tank very well as well, you can get a full heal, even more so with a Koga, because you can bounce him back to your hand, get a full heal and a free retreat on top of that. Now, because the Executor has such a high retreat cost and the Erica doesn't bounce the Executor back to hand like the Koga, because these Pokemon both of them only require a single energy requirement in order to attack, and you are playing both darkness and grass energy. What you do is you put any additional energy you don't need to be placing on your Pokemon to attack on your executors because the retreat cost is 3. All those additional energies you don't need throughout the game, you put on them so that if you don't have an Erica or you don't have a potion to get over a breakpoint that you know is coming on the next turn, you just retreat them and then you wait for those combo pieces to heal them up, or you bring something else in to tank and start attacking in with. I would love to see this deck gets picked up and maybe starts doing well, because it is a very interesting concept. It takes both of those concepts from both those other decks, but with the opposite Pokemon in those decks, basically taking the Wigglytuff out of both of them and then combining the other Pokemon in those decks. And with that being said, let's get into the next deck. So the next deck we want to talk about is a Machamp EX deck, and it combines the Machamp EX with a Onix and Hitmonlee. And what's cool about this deck is it feels very similar to the Brock deck. A lot of people have been playing Brock recently, at least content creators, and basically came to the conclusion that that deck is actually kind of better than what most people think. The fact that Onix and Golem can be ramped into with energy from the Brock basically brings a 4 energy attack for 150 from your Golem down to 3 energy if you think of it. And your Onix is 110 HP basic Pokemon with a 3 energy requirement for 70 damage, but it's really 2 when you get a free one from Brock, and that's super aggressive for a very bulky Pokemon. Being able to do 70 damage on your second turn of energy placement is super strong, and then when you combined it with something like a Machamp, who has a tremendous curve, a ton of HP with 180, and you're basically able to take out, and you actually are able to take out any Pokemon in the game with your perfect curve. 1 energy on your Machop, 2 on your Machoke, and 3 on your Machamp. That perfect curve with attacking each turn on each one of those Pokemon is exactly 190 HP. That takes out anything that is a Venusaur or below, which is any card in the game. There is a Hitmonlee in this deck as well, which is tremendous because if you get a 70 damage with your Onix and you retreat it and put it on the bench, if it's with that 30 or below damage range, you can just knock it out while it's on the bench by attacking it with your Hitmonlee. This deck is playing 1 Giovanni and 1 Brock. I would have liked to have seen maybe 2 Brock in this and maybe 2 Onix. However, this deck did place in a top 16 in a 250 or more person tournament, and so this deck obviously did very well. Again, I always expect to see at least 1 fighting deck in a top 16 when I'm looking at this, and it has not failed yet. I really wish that fighting was a bit stronger, except the issue is, even though it's so strong into the Pikachu meta, it's very weak into the Mewtwo meta. So I wonder how Golem would do in this, actually. Although I do think in a meta game, Machamp replacing the Golem is actually better. So I'm glad to have seen a deck like this in Machamp and Onix. And just to kind of little tidbit, Machamp and Onix are actually 2 of my favorite Pokemon of all time, so I'm glad to see them in a deck. With that being said, let's get into the next deck. So the next deck we want to talk about is a Starmie Frostmoth deck, and a lot of these Starmie decks that you have seen are most likely Starmie Articuno or Starmie Greninja, but there's also been Starmie Psyduck, and basically it would be 2 Starmie EX lines, 2 Psyduck lines, or 2 Golduck lines, sorry, and 1 or 2 Articuno. Basically, this takes out the Psyduck Golduck lines and replaces them with Frostmoth. And I actually really like this idea, because if you could get early game damage and sweep games with your Starmie, whereas in the other games you might not be able to do that, it's great to have something like a Frostmoth, because this can slow your opponent down and chip in for damage. So basically, Frostmoth puts the active Pokemon to sleep and hits in for 40 damage every time it attacks. And what's really cool about Frostmoth, and why I like to see it in the meta, is because it's not weak to electric. So if you can bring in water decks that have certain Pokemon that are not weak to all the Pikachu decks in the meta, you may give yourself a tremendous amount of opportunity to actually win games. And this actually got second place in a 458 person tournament. And I think it's because of the Frostmoth. You're able to do a lot of stalling, a lot of control by putting them to sleep, chip in for damage, and then massive damage with things like your Starmie. So you can sweep games or you can slow games down, and you kind of make up for the fact that your most water decks are weak to the majority of the meta, which is Pikachu decks, by playing a Frostmoth, which is not weak to it. Now, most decks that you see in the top of the meta for water are Starmie Articuno decks, Starmie Greninja decks, or Articuno Greninja decks. In fact, the Articuno Greninja deck right now seems to be doing the best. It got the most tops out of all the water decks in the meta currently, with 9 total in any tournament with 250 or more people, which is tremendous to see. However, I would love to see if this deck gets picked up and starts to do a little bit better. Frostmoth is not that strong, even though it is not weak to electric because it is only 90 HP. If it had that little bit more of HP, it might be a little bit stronger, but it still basically gets knocked out by a Pikachu regardless, which is kind of frustrating. But the fact that you can put a Pikachu to sleep and it can't evolve into anything because it's an EX Pokemon is kind of interesting, that you can slow the game down and possibly take them out before they take you out. And with that being said, let's get into the next deck. So the last deck is always the most interesting in this series. I always try to save the most interesting for last, and it's an Articuno Aerodactyl deck. Basically, it's an 18 trainer Articuno deck, and you're just adding into Aerodactyl because 2 of the trainers you're playing are the fossil card, the Old Ember. And so basically, what you do is you play it exactly like an Articuno 18 trainer deck. And because you're playing the fossils, you still automatically start with the Articuno EX in hand. You can build these guys up really fast in general, or with a Misty, and start trying to take the game over instantly. And the cool thing is, because you're playing the Aerodactyl, what happens is, if you find yourself in a position where you're up against either a Charizard or a Mewtwo that is fully loaded, what you can do is you can either, if it gets knocked out or if it's not knocked out yet and you have a chance to retreat it and bring in your Aerodactyl, you can try to take control of the game back by getting that lucky coin flip and taking off all those energies on those Charizard and all those energies on those Mewtwo, and then sending those cards back into the opponent's deck, sending them, putting them back tremendously on their tempo and trying to take control of the game back. This deck, it didn't get top 16, but it did go 8-3, which is kind of surprising. I don't know if the Aerodactyl played a tremendous part in that or not. It did get 22nd, but it was in a very large tournament, at least 250 or more people. And so with that being said, that's it for the top 10 decks of the week. And as always, keep cooking.